The profound impact of logistics, particularly food supply, on the conduct and outcome of warfare. Military operations at their core depend on the consistent flow of supplies to sustain personnel and equipment. Among these necessities, food stands out as the most fundamental requirement for any fighting force. Without a reliable system to provide sustenance, the ability of a military to engage in and endure combat is severely compromised. Professionals in the field of warfare recognize that the capacity to maintain troops and their equipment over time is a critical determinant of success. Indeed, even the most brilliant tactical maneuvers can be rendered ineffective if the forces executing them are weakened by a lack of essential supplies. Conversely, while superior logistical capabilities alone may not guarantee victory, a future in logistics can undoubtedly lead to defeat, a failure in logistics. In the context of conflicts between relatively unequal adversaries or equal adversaries, the side that can more effectively disrupt the opponent's ability to resupply and maintain its forces gains a decisive advantage. The longer a war between such powers persists, the greater the cost for all involved, making the ability to sustain operations while denying the same to the enemy paramount. Consequently, a robust and resilient logistics system not only supports military action, but can also serve as a powerful deterrent. If a potential aggressor doubts its capacity to sever an opposing force's supply lines, it may reconsider initiating hostilities in the first place. Therefore, the development and maintenance of effective logistics during peacetime are essential for ensuring readiness and the ability to respond effectively in times of crisis or conflict. The interconnectedness of military logistics and the private sector, particularly in areas like transportation and technology, further underscores the complexity and importance of this aspect of warfare. Well, this is a quote from U.S. Marine General Robert Barrow III, and he says, "Amateurs talk tactics, but professionals talk logistics." It probably encapsulates a profound understanding within military circles that while the intricacies of tactical engagements often capture public attention, the true foundation of military success lies in the often unseen realm of logistics. The quote emphasizes that seasoned military professionals recognize the paramount importance of ensuring that troops are adequately supplied, equipped, and sustained for any operation. Without this logistical underpinning, even the most skillfully devised tactics are likely to falter. The ability to move personnel and material, maintain equipment, and provide essential support is what ultimately enables a military force to achieve its objectives. Therefore, this adage serves as a constant reminder that effective planning and resource management are the cornerstones of any successful military campaign, often overshadowing the immediate focus on battlefield maneuvers. Throughout history, the control and manipulation of food have been more devastating than conventional weaponry. This report posits that throughout history, the ability to control and manipulate food supplies has often proven to be a more devastating weapon than conventional arms. While the immediate impact of battlefield engagements is undeniable, the strategic use and denial of food have had far-reaching and often more profound consequences on the course of wars and the suffering of populations. This includes not only the disruption of an enemy's food lines to weaken their fighting capacity, but also the deliberate manipulation of food supplies to subjugate civilian populations, achieve political aims, or even commit genocide. The slow but inexorable impact of hunger can lead to widespread death, disease, displacement, and the collapse of societal structures, often with a more comprehensive and lasting effect than the immediate destruction caused by traditional weaponry. By examining historical cases and contemporary situations, we will explore the multifaceted ways in which food has been and continues to be a critical weapon in the arsenal of warfare, often with more devastating results than swords or guns. An example is the Biafran War in Nigeria from 1967 to 1970. The Nigerian Civil War witnessed a tragic episode of conflict-driven hunger with the blockade of the Republic of Biafra by the Nigerian federal government. The federal government imposed a comprehensive embargo on all shipping and air traffic to and from Biafra, effectively cutting off access to essential supplies, including food and medicine. Nigerian officials openly stated that starvation was a legitimate tactic of war. This blockade led to a catastrophic famine in Biafra, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 500,000 to 2 million civilians, many of whom were children suffering from severe malnutrition. International humanitarian efforts to provide relief were obstructed. The Biafran War brought the issue of using starvation as a weapon of war to global attention and highlighted the devastating consequences of blockades on civilian populations in conflicts. Another example is the Holodomor, which occurred in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. The Holodomor, a Ukrainian term meaning death by starvation, stands as a stark and tragic example of conflict-driven hunger, specifically a politically engineered famine in Soviet Ukraine during 1932 and 1933. Under the totalitarian regime of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet government implemented policies that deliberately caused the starvation deaths of an estimated 7 to 10 million Ukrainian citizens. This famine is widely recognized as an act of genocide aimed at crushing Ukrainian national identity and the resistance of the rural peasantry to forced collectivization. The Soviet authorities forcibly requisitioned grain and all other food supplies from Ukrainian farmers, leaving them with nothing to eat while simultaneously preventing them from leaving the affected areas and rejecting offers of international aid. Despite sufficient grain reserves in the USSR, these were not used to alleviate the famine in Ukraine. The deliberate nature of these actions underscores how hunger can be weaponized by a state against its own population to achieve political ends. A further example is the ongoing conflicts in Yemen and Syria. The protracted conflicts in Yemen and Syria continue to drive severe food insecurity for millions of civilians. In Yemen, years of civil war have led to widespread displacement, the destruction of infrastructure, and the disruption of agricultural production and food distribution systems, leaving over half the population facing acute hunger and the risk of famine. Restricted access for humanitarian aid further exacerbates the crisis. Similarly, in Syria, over a decade of conflict has caused immense destruction and displacement, leading to a collapse of the economy and leaving nearly 13 million people food insecure. The ongoing warfare and political instability continue to hinder efforts to ensure food security for the civilian population. These contemporary examples underscore how armed conflict remains a primary driver of hunger on a massive scale, often exacerbated by tactics that deliberately impede access to food and other essential resources. The idea of food as a weapon of war is not new. A central tenet of Sun Tzu's approach in his book on war was the advocacy for foraging on the enemy. This idea not only replenished an army's stores, but also simultaneously deprived the adversary of sustenance. Capturing provisions from the enemy was far more efficient than transporting them from one's own territory. Stating that 1 cartload of the enemy's provisions is equivalent to 20 of one's own, Sun Tzu meticulously outlined the dire consequences of neglecting food logistics. Maintaining an army at a distance through state contributions would impoverish the populace. The presence of an army could inflate prices, draining the people's substance and leading to heavy exactions. Protracted campaigns led to the exhaustion of resources and a decline in the army's fighting spirit. Karl von Clausewitz, the famous European theorist of war, provided a more comprehensive theoretical framework for understanding the intricate relationship between warfare and resources, including the crucial role of food supply in protracted conflicts. Alexander the Great's logistics reforms included his innovations in all kinds of different areas to supply his armies over vast distances. Alexander the Great, renowned for his military conquests across vast territories, understood the critical importance of logistics and implemented significant reforms to ensure his armies were adequately supplied, particularly with food, over extended campaigns. He integrated logistics directly into his strategic planning, recognizing that the ability to sustain his forces was paramount to his military objectives. One of his key reforms was the reduction of the extensive baggage train that traditionally accompanied Greek armies, which often included large numbers of non-combatants. By limiting the number of civilians and utilizing more efficient pack animals like horses and camels, Alexander significantly increased the speed and maneuverability of his army. He notably forbade the use of slow and cumbersome ox carts, a practice common in earlier Greek armies. To further streamline his supply efforts, Alexander developed strategic alliances with local populations to secure provisions along his routes. He also strategically used waterways, marching his troops along rivers to facilitate easier access to sea transport for supplies whenever feasible. In anticipation of his army's arrival, Alexander made agreements with allied or surrendered cities to establish shelters and supply depots in advance. He even implemented forced marches to conserve supplies and reduce the time needed for conveyance. Recognizing the importance of a dedicated logistical command, Alexander created the position of skoidos, a transport officer responsible for managing the baggage train, ensuring its protection and overseeing the distribution of resources. For the bulk of his army's sustenance, Alexander preferred easily obtainable grains such as wheat, barley, and millet, which could be stored for long periods and ground into flour using hand mills carried by servants. These comprehensive logistical reforms were instrumental in enabling Alexander's army to operate effectively over vast distances and sustain its remarkable pace of conquest. In ancient warfare, a common practice for supplying armies, including those of Sun Tzu, and during the campaigns of Alexander the Great, was foraging, the acquisition of food and other resources directly from the local environment. Roman soldiers, for example, typically carried only a 3-day ration, expecting to supplement this by foraging along their march. The prevalence and limitations of foraging include the reliance on local resources and the constraints it imposed on military campaigns. While foraging offered a degree of flexibility and reduced the immediate reliance on long and vulnerable supply lines, it also imposed significant limitations on military campaigns. The availability of food through foraging was inherently dependent on the season, the agricultural productivity of the region, and the presence of a large army, which could quickly deplete local resources. This often constrained the size and duration of military operations, as armies had to remain within a certain radius of viable food sources to sustain themselves. Furthermore, the act of foraging could have negative consequences, potentially antagonizing local populations who might resist the seizure of their food and livestock, leading to conflict and instability in conquered territories. While Alexander the Great utilized foraging, his logistical reforms also aimed to reduce his army's complete dependence on it, recognizing its inherent unreliability. The disastrous Russian campaign of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812 starkly illustrates the limitations of relying on foraging in a vast and sparsely populated territory, especially when coupled with the enemy's deliberate denial of resources through a scorched earth policy. Ultimately, the transition towards more organized and reliable supply systems became crucial for enabling larger and more sustained military campaigns in later periods. Throughout history, navigable waterways such as rivers and coasts have held immense strategic importance for military logistics, offering a far more efficient means of transporting large quantities of troops and supplies compared to the limitations of land-based transport in ancient times. Alexander the Great, recognizing this advantage, strategically planned his campaigns to follow rivers, ensuring easier access to sea transport for the resupply of his army. The Roman Empire's extensive control over the Mediterranean Sea was fundamental to its military power, enabling the efficient movement of legions and the transport of vital resources, including the massive amounts of grain needed to sustain both the army and the population of Rome across its vast domain. Rivers not only served as transportation arteries, but also provided a crucial source of drinking water for both soldiers and their animals, a fundamental requirement for any sustained military operation. The ease of moving bulk goods like grain and water via ships and river barges, compared to the arduous and slow process of overland transport using pack animals or rudimentary carts, made a proximity to waterways a significant factor in military strategic planning for centuries. The Roman Empire's extensive control over the Mediterranean Sea was fundamental to its military power, enabling the efficient movement of legions and the transport of vital resources, including the massive amounts of grain needed to sustain both the army and the population of Rome across its vast domain. Rivers not only served as transportation arteries, but also provided a crucial source of drinking water for both soldiers and their animals, a fundamental requirement for any sustained military operation. The Roman Empire and Mediterranean dominance were all about control of agricultural regions, and sea lanes fueled Roman military power. So the military might of the Roman Empire was inextricably linked to its sophisticated and well-organized logistical system, which ensured a consistent and reliable supply of food to its legions stationed across its vast territories. The standard diet of a Roman soldier primarily consisted of wheat, often consumed as bread or a porridge called pulse, supplemented by rations of smoked bacon or fresh meat, usually pork, cheese, vegetables, olive oil, and wine. This relatively high-calorie diet, estimated at around 3,000 calories per day, was essential for the rigorous demands of military service, which included marching, building fortifications, and engaging in combat. A cornerstone of the Roman logistical system was its control over the Mediterranean Sea, which served as a vital network for the transportation of troops, equipment, and most importantly, food. The Romans heavily relied on the agricultural output of fertile regions surrounding the Mediterranean, particularly Egypt and North Africa, which were major sources of grain. The efficient transport of these staples via Roman-controlled sea lanes ensured that the legions, even those stationed in distant provinces like Britain, Arabia, or Mesopotamia, were consistently supplied with essential provisions. This ability to project logistical power across such a vast empire was a key factor in Rome's sustained military dominance and its capacity to undertake extensive and prolonged campaigns. The Romans even considered certain food items like olive oil to be so important that its absence was considered a hardship for soldiers. The double-edged sword of feeding the army also meant impoverishing the locals. So while efficient provisioning of an army is crucial for its operational effectiveness, the methods employed to achieve this in ancient times often came at a significant cost to the local civilian populations. Armies frequently relied on foraging, requisitioning supplies, or imposing levies on the communities in the areas where they operated. While this provided sustenance for the troops, it could simultaneously deplete local food stores, disrupt agricultural cycles, and lead to widespread food shortages and economic hardship for the civilians. The presence of a large military force could also artificially inflate the prices of food and other essential goods, making them unaffordable for the local populace. In some instances, armies might seize livestock, grain, and other provisions without adequate compensation, leaving communities with insufficient resources to sustain themselves. This exploitation of local resources not only caused immediate suffering, but also often bred resentment and resistance among the civilian population, potentially undermining the long-term stability of military occupation or conquest. Thus, the imperative to feed the army often presented a double-edged sword, securing the immediate needs of the military at the expense of the well-being and potential future cooperation of the local inhabitants. Scorched earth tactics represent a stark example of the deliberate manipulation of food resources in warfare, not for sustenance, but for denial. This military strategy involves destroying anything that could be useful to an advancing enemy, including food supplies, crops, livestock, water sources, buildings, and infrastructure. The primary aim is to deprive the enemy of the resources they need to sustain their forces, hindering their advance, weakening their morale, and potentially forcing them to retreat. The term scorched earth itself gained prominence in the 20th century, but the practice dates back to antiquity. Notable historical examples of successful scorched earth tactics include the Scythians' resistance against the Persian Achaemenid Empire, where they destroyed food supplies and poisoned wells as they retreated into the steppes. During the Second Punic War, both the Carthaginian and Roman forces selectively employed this tactic. In the Gallic Wars, Celtic tribes under Vercingetorix planned to starve the Roman armies by ravaging the countryside. More recent examples include the Russian army's actions during the failed invasions by Sweden, France under Napoleon, and Germany, as well as Sherman's march through the Confederacy during the American Civil War. While a military strategy, the implementation of scorched earth tactics has devastating consequences for civilian populations, who are often left without food, shelter, and the means to survive. The long-term ecological damage can also be significant. Logistical challenges faced by both the Continental Army and the British forces regarding food and supplies during the American Revolution. For the British, the primary challenge was the need to transport vast quantities of provisions across the Atlantic Ocean from Great Britain to North America. The main port for shipping these supplies was Cork, Ireland. However, this long supply line was fraught with difficulties, including inadequate packaging, corruption, poor quality control, and the ever-present threat of storms at sea. American privateers also actively targeted British cargo ships, further disrupting the flow of essential goods. The weekly food allowance for a British soldier was substantial, including bread or flour, beef or pork, butter, peas or oatmeal, rice, and a daily ration of rum, sometimes supplemented by fresh vegetables. Maintaining these levels of supply across such a distance proved to be a constant struggle, leading to frequent shortages. On the American side, the Continental Army faced its own set of formidable logistical challenges. The newly formed nation lacked established administrative procedures, suffered from a chronic scarcity of money and the failure of credit, possessed a weak and underdeveloped transportation system, and had a limited manufacturing capacity. These factors combined with the natural obstacles of geography and weather to create persistent shortages of food, clothing, tents, arms, ammunition, and other essential military supplies throughout the war. The efforts of the Continental Congress to equip and feed its army were often inadequate from the outset, and the sheer magnitude of the task, coupled with the lack of an established supply system, guaranteed serious problems in procurement and distribution. The persistent shortages of food and other essential supplies had a profound and detrimental impact on the morale and effectiveness of the Continental Army. During the American Revolution, the lack of adequate rations and the poor quality of the food that was available led to widespread disease, suffering, and a significant decline in troop morale. The winter encampment at Valley Forge in 1777 stands as a stark example of the devastating consequences of these logistical failures. During this period, soldiers often went for days without sufficient food, with one soldier famously complaining that the biscuits were hard enough to break the teeth of a rat. Such conditions led to rampant illnesses like scurvy and dysentery, significantly weakening the Army's fighting strength. The constant struggle for sustenance and the harsh living conditions contributed to widespread low morale and a surge in desertion rates. General George Washington himself recognized the dire situation, noting that the Army was facing the prospect of starvation, dissolution, or dispersal. Washington made concerted efforts to procure supplies for his troops, sending out procurement parties to seek out local farmers and offer payment for local goods. However, these efforts were often hampered by the high demand for rations from both the Continental and British armies, which drove up prices, and by the reluctance of many farmers to sell to the Continental Army due to a lack of trust in their promissory notes. The cumulative effect of these supply shortages was significantly weakened army, impacting the campaign outcomes and prolonging the war. The reliance on foraging and its limitations during the Russian campaign of Napoleon Bonaparte's massive army, which invaded Russia in 1812, initially relying heavily on the strategy of foraging to supplement the army's carried provisions. This approach served the Grande Armée well in the agriculturally rich and densely populated regions of Central Europe during previous campaigns. However, the vast and sparsely populated territories of Russia presented a starkly different logistical landscape. The distances were immense and the infrastructure was poor, making it difficult to sustain long and reliable supply lines from the rear. Compounding these challenges was the deliberate scorched earth policy implemented by the retreating Russian forces, who systematically destroyed or removed any resources that could potentially be used by the advancing French army, including food and fodder. As the Grande Armée pushed deeper into Russia, the limitations of relying on foraging became increasingly apparent. The local population was sparse, and the scorched earth policy left little to be scavenged from the land. The French had also overestimated the availability of resources along their invasion route and the capacity of the Russian roads to support their supply convoys, which frequently arrived late or not at all. The invading force carried a limited amount of rations, anticipating a swift campaign, but the protracted nature of the advance and the lack of local resources quickly led to severe shortages of food and water for both the soldiers and their horses. The impact of disrupted supply lines on the Grande Armée's defeat, the combination of the vast distances, the harsh Russian terrain and climate, the effectiveness of the Russian scorched earth policy, and the over-reliance on inadequate foraging led to a catastrophic disruption of Napoleon's supply lines during the 1812 campaign. This logistical breakdown had a devastating impact on the Grande Armée, particularly concerning the supply of essential food and winter provisions. As the army advanced and then retreated, it struggled with dwindling rations, leading to widespread starvation, exhaustion, and disease, most notably typhus. The lack of food weakened the soldiers, making them more susceptible to the harsh conditions and the attacks of the Russian forces. The retreat from Moscow became a harrowing ordeal, marked by mass death from starvation, exposure to the brutal winter, and disease. Discipline within the ranks collapsed and the once formidable Grande Armée was decimated. Military historians such as Chandler argue that the failure of logistics, particularly inability to support the army with sufficient food, was the primary reason for the disastrous outcome of the Russian campaign. The fundamental problem was not a lack of supplies in depots far to the rear, but the inability to move these supplies to the soldiers at the front who desperately needed them. This logistical failure ultimately proved to be a decisive factor in Napoleon's defeat. The invention of canning in the early 19th century by Nicolas Appert, a French confectioner, marked a transformative moment in the history of both food preservation and military logistics. Motivated by a competition launched by the French government to find a better method of preserving food for its army and navy during the Napoleonic Wars, Appert's process of heating food in sealed glass jars and later in tin-plated steel cans provided a revolutionary way to extend the shelf life of perishable goods. This innovation had a profound impact on military logistics, fundamentally altering how armies could be supplied and the duration of campaigns they could undertake. Prior to canning, armies were largely reliant on foraging, dried or salted provisions, and the movement of live animals for meat, all of which presented significant limitations in terms of reliability, portability, and nutritional value. Canned food allowed military forces to carry much larger quantities of non-perishable and relatively nutritious food, reducing their dependence on often unreliable local resources and significantly extending the distance and duration of military campaigns. This new technology provided a more stable and transportable source of sustenance, making it possible for armies to operate further from their supply bases for longer periods, thereby expanding the strategic and operational flexibility of military forces. The advent of canned food had a significant impact on both naval and land warfare, offering solutions to long-standing logistical challenges. The British Royal Navy was an early adopter, utilizing canned provisions to sustain soldiers on lengthy voyages, reducing the risk of scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies that had plagued long sea journeys for centuries. By the 1820s, canned beef and pea soup were being taken on Arctic expeditions, demonstrating their utility in extreme and remote environments. On land, canned food became increasingly important for supplying the large armies of the 19th century. During conflicts such as the Crimean War, the American Civil War, and the Franco-Prussian War, canned rations became a staple for soldiers, providing a convenient and relatively reliable source of sustenance in the field. The increased demand from military forces also spurred further development and production of canned goods, leading to improvements in technology and efficiency. The importance of canned food reached its zenith during World War I, where the massive armies involved required unprecedented quantities of easily transportable and non-perishable food. Canned meats like bully beef, along with canned vegetables and stews, formed a significant part of the daily rations for all soldiers on all sides of the conflict. The humble tin can even became a strategic resource itself during World War II. The shift toward large-scale industrialized warfare in the 20th century ushered in the era of total war, a paradigm shift in warfare characterized by the mobilization of entire nations and their industrial capacities for sustained large-scale conflict. This transformation, exemplified by World War I and World War II, had profound implications for resource management, including the production, distribution, and consumption of food. Unlike previous eras, where warfare was often confined to professional armies and limited objectives, total war blurred the lines between combatants and civilians, with the entire national economy becoming a critical component of the war effort. The sheer scale of the armies involved, the intensity of industrialized combat, and the prolonged durations of these conflicts placed unprecedented demands on a nation's resource base. Governments were compelled to take on a far more active role in managing their economies, implementing measures such as centralized planning, rationing of essential goods, including food, and the direction of industrial production towards military needs. Food, in particular, became a critical strategic asset, with the ability to ensure adequate nutrition for both the armed forces and the civilian population directly impacting a nation's capacity to wage war effectively and maintain social stability on the home front. The management of agricultural production, food imports, and distribution networks became central to the overall war strategy. Here are some American military posters urging citizens to work together with the Army to preserve food and operate as a single unit. This is a good introduction to the idea of total war. And this particular slide makes us recognize that massive social changes occurred in the process of World War I. Societies had to become economically self-sufficient, especially in food. They had to maximize war production, they had to maximize labor efficiency, and they had to keep the population behind the war effort. Germany's economic management was critical to understanding what we're talking about here. Faced with a stringent Allied naval blockade that severely restricted imports, including vital food supplies, Germany created a highly centralized and controlled economic system during World War I. To manage scarce resources, the War Raw Materials Board, led by Walter Rathenau, was established. This board exerted centralized control over essential raw materials, including food, overseeing inventory, implementing rationing systems, and directing the retooling of German industry towards war production. Restrictions were also placed on labor movement to ensure workforce stability in key sectors. The German government implemented a comprehensive system of food rationing for civilians, with the quality and quantity of rations often declining as the war progressed. Substitute foodstuffs, often of dubious nutritional value, were introduced to compensate for shortages. The agricultural sector faced significant challenges due to the conscription of farmers and horses, as well as shortages of fertilizers, leading to substantial falls in crop yields. Food shortages were particularly acute in urban areas and disproportionately affected the poor, who were reliant on rations and could not afford the inflated prices on the burgeoning black market. Great Britain's economic actions, initially adhering to a business as usual policy, the British government gradually increased its intervention in the economy, particularly concerning food supply as World War I progressed. The Ministry of Munitions under David Lloyd George played a key role in rationing essential materials for war production. However, it was the intensification of Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 which caused significant losses of merchant shipping and threatened Britain's reliance on imported food that spurred more decisive action. Faced with dwindling wheat supplies and the risk of widespread food shortages, the British government introduced compulsory rationing in stages between December 1917 and February 1918. Ration books were issued to the public for essential items such as butter, margarine, lard, meat, and sugar. Bread was also subsidized to make it more affordable. The government collaborated with trade unions to ensure a stable labor supply for war industries and implemented measures to convert industries to war production, as well as to tax and limit war profits. The war also led to significant changes in the labor force, with a notable increase in the participation of women in traditionally male roles. While fresh vegetables and fruit were not rationed, their availability was limited and some imported varieties became scarce. The government also actively promoted food economy measures and encouraged the public to consume more fish and other non-rationed items. World War I marked a decisive turning point in the relationship between governments and their national economies. The sheer scale and intensity of the conflict demanded an unprecedented level of government intervention in economic planning and execution across the belligerent nations. This was a departure from the prevailing laissez-faire economic philosophies of the pre-war era. Governments on both sides of the conflict recognized that the mobilization of all national resources, human, industrial, and financial, was essential for sustaining a prolonged war effort. To this end, new government agencies and ministries were established to oversee and control key sectors of the economy. Germany's War Raw Material Board and Great Britain's Ministry of Munitions are prime examples of this centralized control. These bodies had the authority to allocate raw materials, direct industrial production towards war needs, regulate labor, and implement price controls on essential goods. Food supply, being a critical factor for both the military and civilian populations, also came under significant government control through rationing systems, price fixing, and the regulation of agricultural production and distribution. Even in the United States, which initially remained neutral, the eventual entry into the war in 1917 led to a dramatic expansion of government economic controls over business and industry. The War Industries Board, the Food Administration, and the Fuel Administration were created to manage production and prices, further illustrating this trend towards a more government-controlled economy. The unexpected success of these controls and their influence on political ideologies, while they were initially met with some skepticism, proved to be surprisingly effective in mobilizing resources on an unprecedented scale and sustaining the war effort for extended periods. So the ability of governments to centrally plan and manage production, allocate essential materials, and ensure that the supply of critical goods like food through rationing and price controls demonstrated a capacity for economic control that had not been widely anticipated before the war. This unexpected success challenged the prevailing pre-war dominance of classical liberal economic thought, which generally advocated for minimal government intervention in the economy. The apparent effectiveness of wartime economic planning, particularly in ensuring a more equitable distribution of scarce resources like food through rationing, lent significant credence to socialist and other collectivist political ideologies. The idea that a government could successfully plan and manage a complex economy for the collective good rather than relying solely on the mechanisms of the free market gained traction among many who had witnessed the perceived successes of wartime economic controls. This combined with the idealistic promises of socialism and for a more just and equitable society led to an increased appeal for socialist ideas as a viable political alternative in the post-war world. The increased appeal of socialism as a viable political alternative meant that governments that could control economies had the chance, well, not had the chance, showed that governments could actually control economies. And that meant that with that capacity to effectively plan and manage complex national economies, ensuring the provision of essential goods and services. So this challenged the long-held belief in the inherent superiority of free market systems, right? And it suggested that centralized planning could be an effective means of addressing societal needs. So all of this led to a sense that socialism was in fact possible, which it had not been believed to be before the war. And that shaped the political debates and policy choices of the 20th century. By the time of World War I, the importance of providing adequate nutrition to soldiers for maintaining their physical and mental well-being was well recognized by most armies. British soldiers serving on the Western Front could generally expect to receive around 4,000 calories per day, with their rations consisting of staples like tinned meat, often referred to as bully beef, hard biscuits, bread, and jam. These were often supplemented with vegetables, and boiled plum puddings were also part of the diet. Tea was a ubiquitous beverage consumed in large quantities. In contrast, German troops often received smaller and less varied rations, particularly as the war progressed and the impact of the Allied blockade intensified. The quality of German bread deteriorated, with ingredients like sawdust and turnips being added to increase its quantity. American soldiers, who entered the war later, were generally better provisioned, receiving reserve rations containing canned meat, dried bread, sugar, coffee, and salt, as well as more varied trench rations when field kitchens could supply them. They also had access to emergency rations of high-calorie foods like chocolate. Delivering hot meals to soldiers in the front line trenches was a significant logistical challenge for all armies, so rations were often eaten cold. Small portable stoves were sometimes used to heat food, and soldiers often concocted stews from tinned meat and biscuits. While essential for survival and maintaining fighting capacity, the monotony and often poor quality of battlefield rations frequently led soldiers to seek out supplementary food whenever possible. An example of the difficulty of food and the way that it can be used in warfare is the Siege of Leningrad, which is a World War II event from 1941 to 1944. The Siege of Leningrad lasted for nearly 900 days during World War II, and it provides another harrowing example of conflict-driven hunger, where the deliberate starvation of civilians was employed as a tactic of war. German forces, rather than attempting a costly direct assault on the heavily fortified city, opted to encircle and blockade Leningrad, aiming to bomb it into submission and starve its inhabitants. This siege resulted in extreme famine due to the complete disruption of food supplies, utilities, and energy. An estimated 800,000 to 1.5 million civilians perished, primarily from starvation and the brutal cold. The daily food rations for civilians were drastically reduced, and people resorted to desperate measures to survive, including consuming anything remotely edible. The deliberate nature of the blockade, with the explicit aim of starving the city into surrender, highlights the use of hunger as a devastating weapon in warfare. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. There is a quiz related to it that is due on Friday. And the next slide is my bibliography. So here you go.